After the Lemurian age is an age which is a very curious one, an age of great progress, but also great conflict, which in some way mirrors the time that we're in at the moment, was called the Atlantean. And this existed for a long time, and it was progressively destroyed. Atlantis was formerly a very large continent which encompassed parts of Europe, parts of Africa, and parts of North and South America. It was destroyed in 2 or 3 main acts of destruction, one about 850,000 years ago, one about 250,000 years ago, which left it with a series of islands. And then finally, the Atlantis, which we're most familiar with, the one that Plato wrote about in the Timaeus and Critias, was basically a single island called Posidonis, which was destroyed, according to him, round about 12,000 years ago. But again, these races and sub-races overlap each other, so that we still see remnants of former races persisting into ones that exist now. So you can't actually divide them up neatly into categories. They are just an evolutionary form. The Ageless Wisdom teaching says that human beings actually developed in 7 different centers on the earth, but this again is quite a complicated matter. So what happens after the 5th subrace of the 5th root race? Well, this is already developing now. The 6th subrace will be very different to us. And we're beginning to see examples of it, as I mentioned a little while ago, with some of the children who are being born. They're much more intuitive, they're much more intelligent, they're much more, in some ways, compassionate and empathic with other people. It's a real change of consciousness. And it's said that this group of people will start to develop over the next few hundred years in places like Australia, South Africa, and parts of America. But before that, there's also another persistent idea which says that a new group will form in Russia, not just in Russia, but in that region of the world. And this is an interesting thought. This is not the mainstream theosophical idea, but it's one that's been put forward by a number of writers. Many, many, many thousands of years from now, we will progress into the 6th root race, of which we know very little indeed. But we know that during this time, human beings will evolve out of having such physical bodies. We will become much more ethereal. We will become much more non-physical. And then we come to the 7th race, about which we can't even really speculate because it's so far in the future, and we will have become so different as human beings that it's impossible to describe. But at the end of that cycle, around 2/3 of human beings will then be in a position to graduate into these higher kingdoms. The ones who haven't made the grade may be forced to rerun some of these things in other places. But again, this is something that's quite complicated. One of the things I find very, very interesting about both science and the esoteric tradition is how it looks at consciousness. As I said at the start of this talk, consciousness is everywhere. It doesn't require a physical form. We're conscious after we die to some degree. And so we don't have a brain anymore. So that consciousness must have a seat somewhere else. Now, science can't define consciousness. It has great difficulty in doing this. And in some ways, it often refuses to do it because it doesn't see that it's the job of science to do this. But if you say consciousness, again, people mean very, very different things about it. Is consciousness just being aware of things? Is it just being able to perceive things? Or is it about being able to use those perceptions to develop ideas and to be creative with that consciousness? I believe that it is. The esoteric tradition, as I said earlier on, and this is a very important point, says that consciousness produces form. and that you don't need form in which to have consciousness. And I'll finish up by, just at the risk of repeating myself from other talks, I think one of the most important things from an everyday perspective is that the Ageless Wisdom tradition and theosophy gives us a very, very different perspective on life and death. We certainly don't believe that we have one life only. We believe, as I said, that we are reborn continually in new bodies, with fresh opportunities, with new challenges, with burdens to bear. And this is where this law of karma is so important. Karma is a moderating principle which, and without it, reincarnation would become meaningless. Karma can crudely be seen as a kind of a judge, jury, and executioner, but it's not that. It's not there just to punish or reward people. It's there as a harmonizing principle to right wrongs, to restore harmony and balance, and to make people learn the results of their misdeeds. But it's not there to destroy us, and it's not there just to give us a bad time all the time. It's there to offer fresh opportunities if we know how to use it. Understanding karma is not just important in the future, it's important right here and right now, because everything that we're doing and everything we're saying and everything we're thinking sends out vibrations which have repercussions both now and in the future. And if we are more careful about what we say and do and think and feel, perhaps we won't have so many bad consequences in the future. Although talking about good karma and bad karma is a purely subjective thing, because if you come into life with various challenges and things to overcome, that may be the best way that you can progress, rather than living on a luxury yacht and not having to work for a living. You know, that might not do you any good whatsoever, whereas a life of challenges and hard work may be the best thing for your spiritual evolution there is. But understanding the laws of karma is it's a creative process, because in some ways we can start to but to shape our lives in the future to some small degree. And this is where we're at variance often with other people who don't have spiritual ideas of any kind. They believe we're just accidental victims of everything and that we don't play any creative role. But we do. Human beings are immensely creative people. And if we learn how to use and harness that creativity in a much more positive way, based on the idea that essentially we are spiritual beings who just happen to be in a physical body at the moment. We're not just physical bodies who happen to have spirits attached. We are first and foremost spiritual beings on a spiritual journey. And here on the 7th of July, 2021, here on Zoom, we all occupy physical bodies, which causes delights, causes problems, causes challenges, and causes all sorts of other things. But you can bet your life, however difficult your life is, this is where you were meant to be. This is the life that you have. Why? Because you chose it. You chose to be in this life. No one else chose it for you. Although, having said that, at earlier stages of evolution, I think people do need some assistance in order to know when and when to reincarnate. But having said so, we choose our parents, we choose our environment, we choose to some degree the circumstances of our lives. And we think, well, why the hell did I do that? Why did I choose such a difficult life for myself? Because that's what you needed. So I'm just about to wind up, but as you can see, there are various interlocking ideas here, which I think are very persuasive. I think they offer a deeper and more panoramic view of ourselves and the wider reality than anything else does at the moment. And I certainly wouldn't want to evangelize or, as David said earlier on, proselytize about these things at all. But people are very welcome to embrace these ideas, to challenge them, to criticize them, and to I don't think we should believe anything until we've explored it for ourselves and run it by our intuitive principles, because our intuition is much more powerful than we ever realized. So I'll wind up there. I've been talking for 55 minutes, and I think that's enough. So if there are any comments or questions, I'd be glad to help try and address them for you. But thank you very much for listening. You're always a very attentive and interesting audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for very interestingly unfolding for us once more the part that we tackled a little bit in last talks, but some more very interesting details have been added to the picture. And I guess again, you cannot cover in 1 hour or 2 hours or 10 hours the whole concept and all the details. But here we are. We have the Q&A session for that to try to zoom in into some of the details, and everybody has the opportunity to check the facts, challenge you, challenge everything, and help each other to develop, right? So everyone are welcome to ask the questions, and I will just remind everyone who might be for the first time here, in order to ask the questions, I will now enable your microphones in a second, but keep them off unless you're given the floor. Don't start your talk without getting the kind of permission or invitation from me, please. So that way we'll have everything in order. And in order to ask your questions, you can use several channels. One is that you find the button raise hand in the participants panel, or hidden under the reaction button, which is underneath of your Zoom screen. For those who are on YouTube, we have 13 viewers from the very beginning. So if you have any questions, please share them. Brother Paul, greetings again to Canada. Please share them in the YouTube chat, and I gladly will share it for the speaker. Same goes here. If for any reason you cannot find the button, or you don't want to express the question for any reasons yourself through the audio or video, please share them privately to me or in public chat here in Zoom, and I will scroll down every single one of them, and as long as the time allows and team allows, we'll be glad to answer all of them without missing any of them. So let's go. Now I will enable everyone's microphones. For a second, Tim, your microphone will be disabled, so you will need to unmute yourself again. And we go to North Colorado, and John is waiting for his chance to challenge. I saw your comments.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Brother Tim, for what a very deep and resonating lecture. I was wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit on the cycles that you had mentioned, the circular type timeframes that, for example, say right now with the way our cycle is, we are experiencing a lot of the energies that were going on in the 2003-2004 time frame. You mentioned about these children and the time and the ages. Are we looking at Pluto in Scorpio type children, indigo type children? Is that what you're talking about? And star seeds? Because when you were talking, I started having flashes of memories of this wonderful place that you were talking about, where we choose all our life. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John, for that. I mean, I will say that I'm not an astrologer. My understanding of astrology is only very, very basic. And of course, there are a number of different types of astrology, as well as the predominant Western type. There is also Vedic astrology, which is very, very interesting, goes back 5,000 years. And in fact, at my Theosophical Lodge in Leeds, in Yorkshire, in England, we actually have an international Vedic astrology conference every autumn. So it's something we do deal with. There's also something which has come out of the works of people like Alice Bailey, which is called esoteric astrology. And this is often an astrology it's often described as an astrology of the soul, whereas conventional astrology is described as an astrology of the personality. The type of children that I was talking about, yes, there are a number of different names for them. They're sometimes called indigo children or star children. There are numerous different names for them. But I think these children have been identified probably for the last, I don't know, 20 years, maybe even longer than that. And they do seem to be children who have made some kind of quantum leap in terms of development. The problem is with some of these children, according to the researchers that I've done, is that because they absorb information in different ways, and because they are generally more intuitive, it can cause them incredible problems, particularly in schools, because they don't necessarily want to sit in rows and just be taught, information like it's filling, the gas up in your car. They prefer to absorb information in much more different ways. And so these children are often diagnosed as having all these silly disorders like ADHD or all sorts, attention deficit disorder and that sort of thing. And it's not that at all. It's just that they are behaving in a very different way. There's been a number of books, some of which I've dipped into, which are very interesting accounts of all this. But the interesting thing is that they seem to be being born all over the world in virtually all countries. It's not something which is the preserve of one country or another. And what I think it shows, despite all the outward appearances, humanity is gradually going through some kind of spiritual uplift. When we look around the world, we might think, well, evidence tells us the contrary. But if you look at how we have evolved mentally, particularly over the last 100, 200 years. I mean, when the American army was recruiting people to go and fight in the First World War in 1917, these were farm boys from Idaho and people from, quite remote parts of the United States. And they found they had an average intelligence of something like 70. 20 years later, just over 20 years later, when they started recruiting people to fight in World War II, they found that there had been a 20% increase in the average intelligence of people. And were they to do that now, I'm sure it would be way ahead of that. So humans are getting smarter. But it's not just about their mental capacities, it's also about these higher principles as well, which we don't know that much about. We often talk about people having left-brained logical responses to things or right-brained more intuitive things. We often say that women tend to be more intuitive and empathic than men, and I'm sure that that's the case, but you do of course get some intuitive men as well. So I think this is all part and parcel of this new cycle which is emerging, in which inwardly we are evolving fairly quickly. I hope that answers your question.
That was wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to even answer my question.
Thank you, John. But if you want to follow up on something, please feel free. I mean, we are here to go into details. All right. We have Brother Hasu, and then we have Brother Robert.
Brother Tim, you take us again on a fantastic journey of knowns and unknowns, a journey of seemingly endless concepts and ideas. But I'm also very interested in the thought that we only think of the universe, our universe. But we forget that there may be many other universes that exist. That we are just looking at it from the very sort of blinkered eye view. This is it. This is our universe. Big Bang, and everything came out, and we were created. And I think the other thing that was also a thought that occurred to me is that if you look at current humanity, and you look at those who live, say, in areas, forests, the Amazon, everywhere, they had created the idea of creation in their own way. Yet, today we call them primitive. You know, and it's strange, you know, that their concepts of creation are exactly what we today will think, that maybe the possibility that that is the right concepts. And it's basically like if you go to someone from say the Amazon comes out and looks at modern technology, he'll think, oh, I'm in another planet. I'm not in my world. His world. So you know, we on Earth are also that person who lives in the Amazon and doesn't realize that this big world is expanding and nature is expanding, and you know we are changing. And of course, the other thing I always think about is that the human body is a sort of a microcosm of the universe, because there's so many processes going, and unless we understand our own selves and understand what goes on within us, it's very difficult to sort of focus and think, oh, the universe trillions of billions of light years away or whatever. So I wonder what your thoughts are, you know, in terms of that sort of concept of ideas, because I come from an Indian Vedic background, so you know we have a sort of a different idea of concepts of creation and the beginnings.
Well, thank you very much for that, Asu. I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it, that the so-called primitive societies managed to live in harmony with the world. And it's only really in the last few hundred years that we've created such a distance between ourselves and nature.
Mm.
You know, when I grew up, it was commonplace for people to say, oh, we have to conquer nature, as if nature was somehow the enemy which needed to be defeated. We always looked on it in militaristic terminology. But what is remarkable is that people like the Babylonians, they were great stargazers. They had immense knowledge of the stars and the cosmos without recourse to telescopes or any other instruments, because the telescope only came into existence in the 16th century. And yet, you know, the Dogon people of West Africa, they knew about distant bodies like Sirius. And not only that, they said that Sirius wasn't just one star, but two or possibly three stars, Sirius A, B, and maybe C as well. How did they know that? Well, this is a very, very interesting idea. And one of the things that Theosophy talks about is the idea that humans have had extraterrestrial guidance throughout their histories. It was said that when the human project started, human beings didn't do all that well. They didn't develop as quickly as was hoped. So they had to send a group of people, and they're generally referred to as the Lords of the Flame, to embed the spark of consciousness in human beings. But every tradition talks about the intervention of star people or gods arriving on chariots, and these may be the extraterrestrials which are talked about so widely today, and which the Pentagon has recently been declassifying documents. And it's felt actually that the Pentagon is going to make some sort of disclosure announcement quite soon. They've been doing it in dribs and drabs. But I would find it astonishing. I mean, it's incredible. It's typically human arrogance to say, oh, we are the only people in the universe. We are the only life form in the universe. Well, the universe, as far as the Ageless Wisdom teachings is concerned, is eternal. It had no beginning, it will have no end. And it's also infinite. It has no start and it has no beginning. So for us to say we are the only life forms of intelligence in this entire universe is absolutely crazy. And also, Madame Blavatsky and others talk about, she talks about myriad other universes. She doesn't go into huge detail about this, but this may not be the only reality. And so I think that these ideas at least open us up to the possibility to explore these things further. But it fascinates me, how did people without any scientific instruments, how did they know these things? How did they identify certain ideas? How did human beings learn the basic skills of agriculture, weaving, medical knowledge, plant knowledge? you know, I'm sure they didn't do it all through trial and error. There must have been some contact with others who were more advanced than themselves in order for this to happen. I mean, I have no deeper knowledge of that other than just a deep intuition that this was the case.
Well, as I think mentioned before, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and how many civilizations have passed through that and would they have left as markers or genetics? We have no idea. But it's very interesting what you say. And, you know, for civilizations to develop without any communications, yet come up with the same concept of astronomy, astrology, agriculture, building, you know, wherever you go, and all the different, there must be something beyond what we are looking at. And so finally, I'm also going to start reading this book, which is called The Esoteric Principles of Vedic Astrology. I just got it from India. You get some wonderful books from India. Thank you very much, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasso. Before giving floor to Robert, we have a question in the chat. So to be fair, I'll take that one from the chat. So the question comes from Fidan Valley. Mr. White, would you agree that we are entering a new era, if you will, where people become more aware that individual consciousness affects the collective consciousness, which in its turn affects the collective well-being? If so, would you say that it is a degradation or growth? Because it seems that we are going back to times of ancient Greek philosophers, which is fine for me personally. So, degradation, growth.
I don't think it's possible to see it in just those terms, but every civilization that has ever existed, and as Hasso said, there have been many over the course of our billions of years of existence. Every civilization has come to an end because it follows that cycle that I mentioned earlier on. No civilization can last forever. I'm fascinated by certainly the Greek civilization of about 500 BC. But then that didn't actually last for all that long. And there were other civilizations around it at the time. And they all eventually become subsumed into others. We talk about ancient Egypt, for example, and yet Egypt was invaded and taken over by other peoples on 16 or 17 occasions over a 3,000-year period. So this shows how everything is in a state of change and how one group of people mix together with another group of people, and you get centers on the earth like Alexandria or Florence, or in every continent there are places where people gravitate, people of different ideas, and they come together and form something much greater than has been known before. Are we in a period of degradation? I think it certainly seems that way, doesn't it? A lot of things are breaking down. Here in my own country, in the UK, it's impossible to get to see a doctor or a dentist. And yet, you know, we're supposed to have this marvelous health service, but it's absolutely impossible. Even doing something very simple these days in the digital age involves setting up a Google account and passwords and putting in all this sort of stuff. And we look on this as a kind of sophistication, but it isn't. We're just getting into a world of over complexity, which I think is overburdening everybody. So we are in a process of major realignment on this planet, and it's going to lead to some quite devastating things. I think we're going to see the effects of a changing climate. Although the climate, you know, having said that, the climate on Earth has always gone through cycles. The extent to which we as human beings have influenced this is a matter of great debate. But whether we have or whether we haven't, it's still a good idea not to poison the oceans and pollute the air. You know, whether we have caused climate change, whether we've been partly responsible or wholly responsible, it shows that we have not had the degree of responsibility that we should have done. And perhaps these crises will teach us these lessons, that we have to be more responsible. This business about individual consciousness also affecting overall consciousness is a very, very important one. It was something I was going to mention in the talk and didn't really get round to that. But each of our thoughts contributes to a collective world consciousness. And we might think, well, we're just one out of 7.5 billion people, and my little thoughts don't count. But it's like every drop in the ocean counts in order to make it an ocean. And this mental body of the earth, this collective consciousness, actually does have an effect on the physical fabric of the earth. And this is something which is very hard for people to understand. And if you put it very, very crudely, this negativity in human consciousness can produce, well, cataclysms. It can actually do things to the physical fabric of the earth so that we see floods or we see volcanoes. Now, the scientists would say, oh, this is just the tectonic plates. But what is the reason behind that? And it's because human consciousness, being the most potent form of consciousness on the earth, does affect it. And it means that somebody gets an idea in Boston, USA, and someone in Uganda somehow taps into that. And so we're not these disconnected individuals living hermetically sealed lives. We are all absolutely in this together. And the thoughts of any one individual will actually have some kind of effect. And when we understand that, I think that we can start to reshape the world in a much more positive way. One illustration of this is called I think it's called the Maharishi principle. And this principle basically says that you only need a very small number of people in order to affect major changes. The idea is that if in one area or one country or in the world as a whole, you only need the square root of 1% of people to start meditating or having positive thoughts. And it starts to have an impact on the immediate local or national or global environment. And this has been shown to be the case. Now, the square root of 1% of the population, even if you take it at 7.7 billion, it's actually only a very, very few thousand people. So it means that a small number of people working together with a concerted voice can actually make things happen very, very quickly. And it doesn't take long for these ideas to percolate out into the wider world. We see this happening all the time at the moment with various ideas which come into the world. So each of us, we need to be careful about our thoughts because we are affecting the world by them. And we're not these disconnected characters that we often imagine ourselves to be.
Thank you. Answer is taken. And Fidan, if you would like to clarify something or go into more details, please.
Yeah, I would just like to thank, for the amazing lecture and for the great add up to my comment, which actually preceded the part of the lecture when it was basically the principles of the cycles were discussed. So I guess like by the end of the lecture, the question was sort of outdated. But thanks again for the great add up on the collective consciousness, and like thanks for mentioning the principle of I noted it for myself. I will certainly Google it. I guess you said Maharishi. Yeah, but yeah, thanks a lot. I will take a look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to New York to Brother Robert.
Hello. Thank you, Tim. You sent me down a few other holes as you continued talking, which is great. And one of the things I was thinking about is while there's collective consciousness, if you're not introspective enough to begin with, that whole know thyself thing, sometimes the go along with a collective can become something harmful. So I think introspection with enough consciousness of what's going on around you, and then working as a collective, ends up being something that really works. When it came to children being slotted into various boxes like ADD and so on. I happen to be a dyslexic, so I had to work with a rewired brain from the time I was 7. I even tie my shoes differently than all other people do. And it's strange because you get picked on if you don't write with your right hand, if you don't tie your shoes the way they taught you at school, if you don't say something a certain way. And there's a sense of being ostracized, that later on, if the child perseveres, they end up excelling. I've seen this many times having worked with kids that were deemed, autistic to the point of it being a problem, whereas their autism actually was an advantage in certain aspects, especially with in areas dealing with numbers and so on. I take a perfect example of a child that's labeled Asperger's is Greta Thunberg. She's done wonders at a very tender age. Whether people agree with her or not, she has got a movement going, took a stand, and so on. And while there's always been these jokes about millennial kids, I've been pleasantly surprised not so much surprised. I've found it pleasant to find how many of them maybe work differently, which brings me to Howard Gardner's book on different ways of knowing. Like, are you a naturalist? Are you mathematically inclined? Are you artistically inclined, and so on? When working with kids that had a certain bent, I found it was best to do portfolio assessment rather than jamming everything in. You must do this form, and found that they excelled by the time they went to college. It was just that during their elementary years and during their middle school years, they were a problem for a system that didn't know how to, classify them. And I think that the more expansive we are in acceptance of different ways of knowing, like cross-culturally, I think one of the biggest things that we have when we get onto a global level are people just not understanding each other's customs is the starting point for a lot of rifts. And that when you have that empathy to go beyond what then you get to expand your mind. It's, what are we told? It's about 10% of our brain that we use. What if these kids are on up to 40%? And we're just trying to play catch up. So I think when it comes to stuff like that, when somebody saying, "Oh, it's a deterioration," I said, "No, it's cyclical." How many times have we heard, the end is nigh, and then it turns out, oh, well, it was a new beginning. Often over the millennia. So rather than looking at the glass half empty, I go with the half full theory and try to keep on plugging on, even though I used to classify myself as a an optocynic or a pessimoptimist. So I figured Murphy's Law prevails, so that, and I was a Boy Scout, so you be prepared, because what can go wrong will go wrong. But if you're prepared for it all, then there are no big surprises, and you get to enjoy the awe of watching something new evolve. But thank you for bringing all that out today.
Well, thank you very much. You raised a number of interesting points there, two of which I'll try to deal with. I couldn't read until I was 8 or 9 years old. And, you know, I think they all thought I was a bit stupid. Well, maybe I am, but it seems ironic that I then went to spend the next 50 years when I left school being a writer and a journalist, someone who couldn't write. And yes, I think many children are treated very badly. As you say, particularly people who are left-handed. And that accounts for round about 1/7 of all people. 14% of people are left-handed. And to force them to write with the other hand is a terrible iniquity. The other point you mentioned at the start of your comments was very, very interesting. This idea of collective consciousness. Yeah, it can work in all sorts of negative ways. And I encountered this a lot during my years working on television and radio and in newspapers. And you go to something like a political demonstration and everything would be, you know, fairly orderly and normal. And then one person does something, and within a few seconds, you have a riot on your hands. People are throwing rocks at the police are charging with batons, or in sporting events, you see it as well in football matches. It just takes one or two people and suddenly there becomes like a collective consciousness. The same at rock concerts as well. People almost park their own personalities at the door sometimes and then absorb the collective consciousness of the event that they're going to see, whether it's a theatrical event or, you know, a stadium rock concert with 100,000 people there. And this can impact very, very negatively, because this collective consciousness then becomes the consciousness of the mob, you know, the gang, the mob, which doesn't really think at all. So you do have to, this is a reason why you do have to be very careful about these things, and you don't get sucked into things. This is how some political movements throughout history have worked. I mean, notably, some of the more authoritarian movements like Mao Zedong's China, Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, where, you know, a relatively small number of people are able to impose their will one way or another on large groups of other people. And it can happen extremely quickly. So I do think we have to be very aware that this collective consciousness exists, but that it can turn ugly. It can become very, very horrible, and it can lead to wars and violence and all sorts of other things. I mean, it always strikes me as being very ironic that in Britain in the 1930s, there was a very strong fascist movement led by a man called Oswald Mosley. And he had his black shirts, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of these people. And eventually the movement started to unravel round about 1936, 37. But 2 years later, most of the people who'd been wearing black shirts and giving Nazi salutes had joined up for the army or the Air Force and the Navy and were actually fighting something. So it shows how easily led people can be, and it shows how susceptible they are to certain ideas, particularly when those ideas come from much stronger people than themselves, because it doesn't take very much for a small number of people to manipulate a lot of people. And indeed, there are those in the world today who believe that this goes on, that there is a tiny elite of people, maybe 1/10 of 1%, who pull all the strings in the world. I don't know if that's the case. One suspects that it might be, but this principle is a very important one, which is why we need to keep track of our thoughts and also keep track of our own independence as human beings, because we recognize that we are connected to all other minds in the world. Yeah.
Thank you. May I use the opportunity to ask one question from me, and then we go to the chat. There are a few more questions. We have a few more hands up. So the question is regarding the thought creation or creation through thought, some forms, and the vibration that is that are being created through thought. So you kind of in detail spoke in details how individual thoughts contribute to the collective consciousness and its effects, and how it may affect the world around us. And my question is, could or is thought form creation manageable on major scale, do you think? Like through media, or certain vibrations, certain thoughts be enhanced through kind of stimulus or whatever. So just I'll try to generalize that into that question.
Well, I'm sure that's the case, and certainly this happens a lot in various religious traditions when, you know, people go together to a mosque or to a church or to a Hindu temple or a Sikh Gurdwara. You know, when they get into that building, you know, they tend to be on their best behavior, and so the vibrations within that building are generally very good. People might not be so good as soon as they walk out of the door, but in these places, it is very, very strong. There is a sense of goodness about these places. But I'm sure, to answer your question, that these thoughts and these aspirations that we have can be enhanced through ritual. I mean, whether that ritual involves the burning of incense or candles, or whether it involves music, or whether it involves ceremony, your Masonic tradition is replete with rituals of one kind or another. The Theosophical movement, which I'm in, doesn't really have any rituals at all. And some people actually complain about this because they say the power of ritual is very, very important in bringing people together and giving people a common purpose, and also helping to focus their minds on a particular issue. So I'm sure that's very important. But I was just thinking the other day when I was watching for those of you outside Europe, we've been having a big football championship on called the Euro finals these last few weeks. And in fact, there is a small football match coming up in about an hour and 20 minutes in which England will no doubt lose to Denmark, but that's another matter entirely. But I was thinking the other day, watching some of the fans behave when their team scores a goal, it's almost like a little riot goes on. And it struck me that sport, certainly in my own country, has become more important to most people in terms of giving them some kind of spiritual uplift than religions have been. It's almost become, like science, a new variation of religion, and people almost experience a kind of a religious ecstasy when their team wins, and it becomes collective, and it becomes very, very infectious. And so a football match, just like a rock concert or a church service or prayers in a mosque, can have a very, very powerful effect on people. And certainly outside mainstream religion, the mystery schools, which have existed all over the world for many thousands of years, they also used rituals of one kind or another to teach aspirants different things. In many of the mystery schools, for example, people went through a prolonged period of 2 or 3 days in which they went through a kind of imaginary death, and they knew what death was about, and some of these were incredibly realistic, apparently. So ritual is an immensely important thing, but the nature of ritual, I think, changes, and it's changed in the world to some degree because of mass communications, television, radio, film, the internet, and other things, so that people become much more aware of each other's rituals and traditions. And I wish in my own movement we had something more ceremonial, even though I'm not personally very big on ritual. I think it's also a way of preserving a particular set of traditions and ideas and giving a sense of continuity, because you know that the ritual is going to be more or less the same each time you go. When you go into a church, you know there will be some hymns and the priest will say something, and there'll be some prayers and whatever. And each religion has its own version of that. And these are very, very powerful things to, I think, rejuvenate people in many ways. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We go to Caleb in the United States again.
Greetings, Tim and David. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes,
Yes.
please go ahead.
Excellent. I was pretty intrigued early on with some of the theosophical teachings, and at about 16 years old, I used to go to an esoteric bookstore that was called the Seven Rays. And when I was there, I was exposed to The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled and some other works by Leadbeater and certain traditions within that fold. And it wasn't later on until I petitioned a lodge that I would join Masonry. And at least within the Masonic context or the initiatic path, it was a great, felt like a great rite of passage that marked my life. And in that context, you know, you're approached with concepts of mortality and temporality and existentialism and hermeneutics, perhaps, of certain texts, and it becomes very, very intriguing. And as I read further, it seemed that there was a real place to learn, like a nice, safe place to be able to learn. And also, I found and gave great credence to the idea of needing to unlearn certain attitudes, or perhaps what I defined as being educated in certain contexts. And one of the most fascinating concepts that I approached when I was reading further about the Theosophical Society, and I'm hoping you could help provide a little bit of insight or clarity to this, Tim, is the idea of Maitreya, or a world teacher. So the idea of ascended masters and the Great White Brotherhood and people who were sort of guiding humanity, if you will. And I found that concept very interesting. And of course, coming from a more of a Judeo-Christian background, I was attributing it to Christic thought, concepts of the Messiah, or even in the Judeo context, the concept of Mashiach, and some sort of coming of fruition of certain people throughout the course of time that were there to help and guide humanity. And I found that very interesting. And at the same time, having undergone Masonic initiations, it sort of cultivated within me the need for critical thinking. And that I thought to myself, well, the best teachers seem to remain students, and that we should have certain caution, and wise brothers would give you certain admonitions that we're not necessarily here to teach you what to think and how to think. That some of the most important aspects of our craft, or perhaps some of the other teachings that one might find, is that we practice our free will and our agency and our ability to think for ourselves and be critical. So of course that could be perceived as relatively individualist, and there are certain collective consciousness that we would like to be aware of or inculcate. And I'm just curious if you could just elaborate briefly, for the sake of brevity, Tim, on the ideas of Maitreya and the ideas of the Ascended Masters, and how perhaps maybe this would be also a good opportunity to give you a platform to dispel some of the misconceptions or criticisms that may have arrived from teachings in the Theosophical Society, for example, regarding root races, and how some people took that concept, misconstrued them, in my opinion, and ran with them and did terrible things.